Hello learners, welcome back to the course on social processes and behavioral issues. We are in yet another exciting topic, exciting session of this course, and we are today entering into Unit 11, Session 1. Today's topic is very exciting, very common, but yet can be very complex if one does not understand it properly, and we today shall be talking about perception and its fundamentals. Perception is a word which is probably one of the most commonly used words by individuals, but what exactly does it mean and how exactly does it happen is what we shall be concentrating today on. In specific, today's session shall be focusing on the meaning of perception, perception and attention, and perception and organization. Perception is one of the most complex cognitive activities in the human brain, and hence it is necessary on our part to decode this process as it happens and understand that what is it in the human brain that allows us to perceive in the sense of the word that we understand. So now, moving ahead to the fundamental question that what is perception? Perception is a unique interpretation of a situation and not an exact recording of it. I think we need to be very clear about the statement that very often what we perceive can be very, very different from the reality of the situation. So perception is our own unique interpretation of a situation and not a recording of a situation as it has happened. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, perception is a complex cognitive process that aims a very unique picture of the world, a picture that once again may be different from reality. And an employee or the individual's perception may be thought upon as a filter. So, which means the word filter, which signifies that there are certain things or certain elements which a person's perceptual process filters out as unimportant in order to concentrate on what is more important. Hence, for us, it is very important to understand that how does this filtering happen? How do we perceive? So, coming to the basic flow chart of the perceptual process, as perception is a cognitive process, there is a flow chart to it that this is how exactly it happens. Now, it's complicated, but it's something that happens in a split of a second also. So, it's very interesting on our part to understand what this flowchart is. Now, if you look at the flowchart, we start with receiving of stimuli. Every individual receives thousands of stimuli, which may be internal and which may be external. Now, the next process is how do we select stimuli? We don't respond to all of them. So there are certain external factors and internal factors which allow us to select some stimuli as being more important than others for us to respond to them. So what are the external factors? External factors can be the nature of the stimuli, location, size, contrast, movement, repetition, similarity. And internal factors can be our own learning processes, our own needs, our age, and our interest. Now, for example, if we look at this internet generation, and we see that young people, young, old, and the world alike is hooked to the internet, is hooked to different gadgets like an iPad, like a mobile, like smartphones, etc. Now, we need to understand that how this happens. Sometimes, we feel that, we are lost to the world around us. There are hundreds of movements around us, but we are lost to these movements because we are totally focused on our smartphone or on our iPad or the world that we are connected to. So how does this happen? This focus is what the selection of stimuli means. Now, after you select a stimuli or a group of stimuli, you need to organize it. And there are certain principles of organizing, which we will be discussing in today's session, like figure background, perceptual grouping, similarity, proximity, closure, and continuity. After selection and organization are over, it is important for us to go into interpretation. And in interpretation, we shall be talking about the perceptual biases and errors which normally individuals indulge in. And after interpreting, we select our response or we respond to the stimuli. So, when we talk about stimulus and response, Actually, we need to understand that there are certain steps between the receipt of a stimulus and our response to the stimulus. And once again, to reiterate, what are they? Selecting stimuli, organizing, interpreting, and then responding. And this entire flow chart or this process map is called as the perceptual map. So, as I said, perception may happen in a split of a second, but it's a complex cognitive activity which encompasses many different steps to it. And that's the reason why we come to the next area where we shall be differentiating perception from mere sensation. Now, what is the meaning of sensation? Sensation deals with very elementary behavior that is determined largely by physiological functioning. Now, physiological or bodily functioning determines sensation. So, for example, let us say I throw a stick at you. What is your first response? You will naturally put up your hands in order to evade the stimuli or the stick that is coming towards you. And this kind of a response is largely called as a reflex response. And we term it as elementary behavior, which is included in a word called sensation. So, for example, if there is a fire, naturally, and your senses, your body is telling you that it will not be able to withstand. So, accordingly, the body prepares itself for the flight mode. Now, sensation is different from perception. Why? Because the physical senses are considered to be vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. So, if you're while tasting a food, if it is burnt, if it is salty, if it is sugary, our response is accordingly determined by that particular sense. Now, we need to understand that how there is a difference between perception and sensation. Now, at one point in time, there are numerous stimuli that bombard our senses. Okay. Now, do we respond to all of those stimuli which are bombarding our senses? The answer is a very definite no. Now, how do we select what is more important and reject what we think is less important? This is what we include in the process of perception. Now, that's the reason why the next point comes that perception is more complex and broader than sensation. Now, perceptual filter can be defined as a complicated interaction of selection, organization, and interpretation of stimuli. So, for example, let us say that I am in a boardroom presenting a topic or making a presentation on a topic which has been assigned to me. Now, in that boardroom, there is a light that is bombarding my sense. There is possibly an air conditioner that is bombarding my sense. There are several other cues which may bombard my sense, but am I tuned to them? The answer is no. I'm completely focused on the presentation that I'm making. So how does this happen? This process is called as a perceptual filter. And that's the reason why perception moves many steps ahead of sensation. So once again, if I reiterate to the difference between the two, sensation is very elementary behavior, whereas perception involves complex cognitive behavior in an individual. Now, moving ahead, how do we select? We have been talking about filter, that perception involves a filter. So, when so many senses are bombarding the mind at the same time, the person, the individual psyche at the same time, it is the individual who decides what to focus on and what not to focus on. So what are all those factors that help us select? And this is called as perceptual selectivity and attention. Now, the first here is called as intensity. What is the meaning of intensity? More intense the external stimulus is, the more likely it is to be perceived. For example, bright light, loud noise, etc. So these are, these determine the intensity of a stimuli. If the stimuli is very intense, then there is a likelihood that it may be perceived as important. Then the next is size. Larger the object is, the more likely it is to be perceived because it can be seen. The third point in the list is contrast. External stimuli that will stand out against the background or that are not what people are expecting will receive attention. If a person is dressed in a funny way, he will catch the attention of others because it's a contrast to what we normally expect. Now, if you look at the background and you look at the object, if there is a contrast between the background and the object stands out, and that's how you notice it. That is the reason why very often in presentations, when we are making our PowerPoint presentations, we are concerned about the background and the font and the color, etc. So that the sentences or the stuff that we put in on the PowerPoint presentation should stand out against the background. So these are some important areas that we need to understand. So the first is intensity, the second is size, and the third is contrast. Moving ahead, the fourth is repetition. Now, what is the principle of repetition state? That repeated external stimulus will get more attention than a single one. So if there is repetition in an external stimulus, that means it is shown time and again, or there are repeated instructions, or something that is repeating the stimulus time and time over again, will catch the attention of a person. Now, for example, repeated instructions for dull tasks, very, very dull, routine, mundane tasks. We give very often repeated instructions for them so that people don't miss out. So that's the principle of repetition, which comes forth. Then is the principle of motion. People will pay more attention to moving objects in their field of vision than they will pay to stationary objects. So this is a principle which has been very often used by the advertising world, where when you look at ads, you will find that there is always a sense of motion, which is how the ad makers capture our interest. So please remember that when you are looking at stationary objects, your attention will not go very quickly to them. But when you are looking at objects in motion, yes, there is a chance or likelihood that these objects may be perceived more frequently. Now, production line workers devote their attention to slowly moving materials that they are working on. And the last is very interesting. That's called novelty or the newness. Either a novel or familiar external situation can serve as an attention getter. Okay. So when you are confronted with anything that you have not expected or anything that you have not seen before, naturally your attention will be focused on it. So that's called as novelty. And the example that I want to cite here is the classic Hawthorne experiments, which marked the beginning of organization behavior as an independent discipline. The Hawthorne experiments were conducted by the renowned scientist Elton Mayo and his team of colleagues in the Western Electric Company. And the experiments were called as the Hawthorne experiments because they were conducted in the Hawthorne plant of this factory. Now, why were the experiments so very important? They were carried out in 3 phases, the first of which was the illumination studies or the light intensity studies. This is where they depicted the importance of novelty. Naturally, because they were experiments, there was a test group and a control group. And it was seen that in the test group, the light was manipulated. That means the brightness of the light, which is necessary for workers to do their job, that kept on decreasing. And at one point in time, it was seen that workers were producing by the moonlight only. So there was no light. And on the other hand, in the control group, nothing changed. I mean, the light intensity remained as it is, which is required for people to produce. But very strangely, Elton Mayo and his team found that the test group produced far better than the control group. And at the end of the experiments, they concluded that because of the novelty of the situation, because of the attention and the focus that was given to the test group, people fared better than the control group where everything remained largely unchanged. So novelty is very important, and we need to keep that in mind when we want people to pay attention to us. So these are the 6 things that you need to remember. The first is intensity, size, contrast, repetition, motion, novelty, which help in perceptual selectivity and attention. But selection alone is not important. After selection, we need to organize. So how do we organize? So here is where we come to perceptual selectivity and organization. Now, the first principle of organizing is figure ground. Figure ground is considered to be the most basic form of perceptual organization, which depends on the Gestalt principle of the organized whole. Gestalt psychologists were the first to study perception around the 1920s, and they were very, very famous people like Kohler, Kofka, Lewin, and these were the people who have contributed heavily to our understanding of the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization. Now, what is the idea of figure ground? Perceived objects stand out as separable from their general background. When we perceive an object, we separate it in our mind from its background. So please remember, in a crowd, when you are focusing on the person who you want to meet, and when you focus, when you see that person in a crowd, what are you able to do? In your mind, you are able to separate that person from the crowd of people who are around that person. So this principle is called as figure ground. Then moving on, we go to perceptual grouping. This Gestalt principle states that people have a tendency to group together stimulus that they perceive into a recognizable pattern. Now, how does this happen? This happens through 4 methods. The first of which is called closure, continuity, proximity, or similarity. Now, let's look at the first principle, which is closure. What is the meaning here? That people have a tendency to close gaps and perceive a whole when one does not actually exist. So, if I look at this picture, which is there in this slide, and you take a look at this circle is actually not a circle. There is a gap that's remaining, but still I call it a circle because there is that sense of closure in my mind. Now, moving on, continuity. If you see patterns together, then you look at them as continuous lines or continuous relationships. Now, closure supplies the missing lines, whereas continuity supplies the continuous lines. Now, when you move ahead, you have the third principle of perceptual grouping, which is called as proximity. Now, group of stimuli who are together will be seen as one whole. So, if I'm looking at these dots, when I look at them together, then I see them as one whole. Now, if you look at department or work groups, let us say in an organization, we look at the HR department, we look at the finance department, the production department, they are looked at as one single department. And the reason is proximity. Now, the next is similarity. Greater is the similarity of the stimuli, the greater the tendency to perceive them as a common group. Now, if you look at this picture, you have black squares and white squares. So the black and the white squares are perceived as 2 groups of squares because of the principle of similarity. I call them black because I see the black color, and I call them white because I see the white color. Now, how does the principle of similarity actually, act out in real life? Now, I have put down an example of minority communities. Minority communities are also perceived on the basis of similarity. For example, when you're looking at particular religious communities, or when you're looking at particular tribal communities, you look at them as one whole. Why? Because of the principle of similarity. Now, moving ahead to higher forms of perceptual organization, you have something called as perceptual constancy. This is quite a sophisticated form of organization, and it gives stability to a person in an ever-changing world. So what does it mean? Even if you see, the idea here is, even if you look at stimulus, you look at their intensity, their size, their brightness, their contrast, etc., you are able to find out something called as a constant. That means you don't have to look at the same things again and again. You're able to form some kind of stability in your mind and make sure that you are able to perceive. For example, let us say that I have taken a new auditor or a chartered accountant into my organization, and I give him the financial statements, and this person goes through them. But post going through them, the person is able to enact his or her own work within a specified period of time. How does that happen? That happens because of constancy. So there is a stability. So, when you look at a particular stimulus, that can be anything. That is a chapter that you listen to or that you learn. That can be a book that you are reading. You don't have to go through the same things time and again to determine their intensity, their contrast, etc., etc., etc. Your brain is able to form that sense of constancy that this is how it is. So then you move ahead for grouping. The last and the most sophisticated grouping of stimulus is context, perceptual context. You give meaning and value to any kind of stimulus based on the context that you are in. For example, let us say the color white. The color white is worn in weddings in the Western context, but the color white symbolizes mourning in the Indian context. So we are able to differentiate all of this because of perceptual context. So in an organization, every single cue, let us say a pat on the back, let us say words of recognition, let us say punishment, everything is given meaning to depending on the context in which it is taking place. We need to realize that none of the human activities appear or happen in a vacuum. They are given meaning because of the context that they appear in. And that's how people group things or stimulus in their mind. Now, if we look at today's class, what all things have we covered? We've gone through the fundamentals of perception, the perceptual roadmap, the difference between perception and sensation, which is very important, which is where we realize that perception is not elementary behavior, and it involves three things which are called as selecting, organizing, and interpreting. So what are the 6 principles of selection? What are the principles of organization, and how do you actually interpret objects or stimulus through constancy and through context? So thank you for your attention, and we will again meet next with another interesting session on perception. Happy learning to all of you.